Hello, Packer fans, wherever you may be. It's time for your cut down day edition of the Pack Attack Cast on August 26th, 2025. Very, very melancholy day for me when I have spent so much time watching players in practice and the preseason fight to be a member of your Green Bay Packers. To have a cut down where so many of them just don't make it, at least for now. There's still the ability to be put back onto the practice squad or picked up by another team. Generally speaking, the Packers are well respected with regard to the development of offensive line, defensive line. So some of the players that are cut today, if they don't make it through waivers, are probably going to get picked up by other teams or hopefully get on to the practice squad. Some interesting news and notes from the list, which was just released about 5 minutes ago. Some teams really try to get their cuts out throughout the day, but the Packers really do a good job of holding the information as much as possible until the deadline to limit how many of their players will probably be picked up by waivers. Waivers obviously has a short time period, and the less time that the Packers give other teams to look at film, the better it is for the Packers to get some of their players back on the practice squad. So it makes a lot of sense. So without further ado, let's take a look at the list that was just released. Go ahead and share my screen. Un momento. We're going to share our screen. Doing it live. We're doing it live. So, on the 53-man roster, which was just released, this is on Packers.com. Straight from the horse's mouth, if you will. Here's a look at the 2025 to 2026 53-man roster. Of course, we've got Jordan Love here. We've got Nate Hobbs. Got some defensive players here. And, of course, Jaden Reed there, just to highlight the pictures. So the Packers reduced their roster to 53 players. We're going to look at this live from the website, and I'm just going to give you my initial thoughts. I took a quick look at it for about 30 seconds before we went live, so you're getting as close to live as you can get to my reaction here. I'm going to try to highlight where my roster predictions differentiated and give you some on-the-spot thoughts on what it might mean for the roster and for the players in question. So, for quarterback, we've got Jordan Love and Malik Willis, released Sean Clifford and Taylor Ilgersma. We're going to have to see who gets through waivers, of course. But I believe if Ilgersma gets through waivers, I think he will be put on the practice squad and be your default number 3. If by any chance Ilgersma does get taken, then they would probably look at other options and Sean Clifford. I think it's Ilgersma's job to win, but if Sean Clifford is the best option after waivers, I think the Packers will look around at other rosters and other cuts. There's some players that are interesting out there. Some younger players that were cut, that were draft picks, that might actually be viable options for the Packers to pick up. So we'll see. But I do believe the Packers do like the upside of Ilgersma, and he's been in the system, so he's more of a known commodity. So we'll see what happens there. Let's look at running backs here. Josh Jacobs, Emmanuel Wilson, Chris Brooks, as I predicted. Injured reserve designated to return, Marshawn Lloyd, as I predicted. Released Anabakanda, Johnson, and Tyron Davis-Pierce. Per my video yesterday, I believe Amar Johnson and Abakanda would be options for the practice squad if they make it through waivers. So I'm very interested to see who makes it through waivers, which I believe we'll find out tomorrow. We have, for wide receivers, only 6, which is interesting to me. I thought they might take 7. So we've got Dobbs, Reed, Donatavian Wicks, Matthew Golden, Malik Heath, and Savion Williams. Those are all players that I predicted. But I believe I thought they would keep 1 additional, so they would have 7. Unable to perform on the PUP list is Christian Watson, who will be back week 4. Now, the fact that the Packers only took 6 wide receivers leads me to believe that Reed and Wicks, who are currently injured, will probably be good to go for week 1. So I'm trying to piece things together. These health updates are so hard to get after training camp is over. But I think Reed and Wicks, look for them to be practicing as early as this week and be ready for week number 1. That's my prediction. Since now they can always get some of these players that were released, put them onto the practice squad and call them up for game day. But I feel like they would have kept 7 if they were worried about Reed or Wicks being ready for week 1. Released was Hardman, Hicks, Cornelius Johnson, Will Shepard, and Isaiah Nair. For those players, I actually like Johnson, Shepard, and Nair to be possible additions to the practice squad. I know Hicks has bumped around for a while, but I haven't seen any real big growth for him. So Johnson and Nair, and to a lesser extent Shepard, kind of have some upside as unknown quantities that I would like to see them maybe bring back to the practice squad. Tucker Kraft, Musgrave, Fitzpatrick, and Sims. For tight end, as I predicted, release Swenson and Lumpkin. Maybe Swenson gets back to the practice squad. Tight ends are always a really good player to have around for special teams. So Swenson might get put on the practice squad so they have him available for special teams or an emergency tight end situation. Let's look at offensive line. They only took 9. I projected 10. So Jenkins, Banks, Tom, Walker, Ryan, Morgan, Belton, Kennard, and Donovan Jennings. Injured reserve designated to return, Jacob Monk. Okay, so this is actually a big surprise for me. So injured reserve designated to return is Monk. So that means Monk is expected to be back within 4 weeks. So they kept 10 as I predicted, but they kept 1 as designated to return. Physically unable to perform as expected is John Williams here. He hasn't been able to play throughout the regular season. Now, I had Kadeem Telfort making the 10 that I expected to come back. So Telfort might be a player that they try to bring back and put on the practice squad. One of the reasons Telfort was brought in initially was because he's a big, strong, 300-pound plus offensive lineman, which the Packers are kind of leaning towards if you look at the most recent drafts. And if you looked at Peter on Locked On Packers today, he kind of talked about that trend. And I kind of echo that segment, that the Packers are definitely looking for larger offensive linemen. So I do expect Telfort, if he makes it through waivers, will probably end up on the practice squad. So we'll see what happens there. It's really hard for offensive linemen to make it through waivers. If they have any sort of ability or trait like size, like Telford has, usually other teams are going to sweep them up. So we'll see if Kadeem Telford makes it through waivers to the practice squad. At defensive end, a little light on defensive end here. So we've got Rashawn Gary, Lucas Van Ness, Inigbare, Brenton Cox, glad to see he made it through, and Baron Sorrell. So we talked about this yesterday on my my podcast. Sorrell making it onto the active roster actually gave them the open spot for Monk here, because you're only allowed to take 2 players designated to return, and they already used one on Lloyd, so Monk is their second player designated to return because they kept Sorrell on the active roster. That tells me Sorrell is either going to be ready week 1 or week 2. Otherwise, I think they would have put him on IR designated to return. So that's actually really good news for the pass rush come week 1 and week 2 against the Lions and the Commanders. Now, you have to keep in mind, and it's very important to look at the roster design here. I think it's impacted by the fact that we have the game against Detroit, then 5 days later we play on Thursday Night Football against the Commanders. So I think Sorrell is more likely than not to be ready week 1 because there's only 5 days between week 1 and week 2. And I think the Packers wouldn't put him on the active roster if he was going to be out more than 2 weeks. So I think Sorrell will probably be ready for week 1. So that's really good news. Again, we're just trying to glean this health information from sources other than beat reporters at practice and at training camp, because we don't have that right now. It's really what the Packers want to release as far as injury information. And if I was the Packers, I would be keeping injury information as tight-lipped as possible up until week 1. Keep the Lions guessing. It's going to keep some of us less guessing as Packers fans, but it's worth it if it keeps the Lions guessing, in my opinion. Physically unable to perform, Colin Oliver, not a surprise. He's not been able to play throughout preseason minicamp and training camp. So Colin Oliver, physically unable to perform. He's eligible to come back week 4, and maybe they try to work him in mid-season. One of the things that's interesting this season, while it's a negative that we have a bye week early, week 5, it is a positive because that coincides with the physically unable to perform 4 weeks. So that might be a benefit to the Packers, in addition to the fact that they're looking at shuffling some people around. An early bye week does allow your team to make major position changes during that bye week, because then they have 2 weeks to practice with the new lineup. So we're going to watch that very carefully. Released is Aaron Mosby and Deslin Alexandre. Aaron Mosby, I hate to see released. He's been a depth Packer player for a very long time. He's been on the practice squad. He's been a well-liked and respected Packer. And he played really well in that Seahawks game. I almost wish he didn't play well in that Seahawks game, because I think it's possible that a team might pick him up on waivers, because he played so well in that Seahawks game. He really flashed. If not, I expect Aaron Mosby to get back to the practice squad. He's very well respected by the Packers coaching staff. For defensive tackles, we have 6. Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, Colby Wooden, Warren Brinson, and Nazir Stackhouse. So we kept 5 tackles five and or sorry, 6 defensive tackles, 5 defensive ends. Um, that was a little surprise to me. Overall, I thought they would keep 10, and they ended up keeping 11. So what this tells me with Clark, Wyatt, Brooks, Wooden, Warren Brinson, and Nazir Stackhouse, what this tells me is the fact that they did not think that Stackhouse would make it through waivers, and that's why they kept Stackhouse on the active roster. I knew all these other players would make it. I'm very excited to see Colby Wooden make it. Colby is a player that actually could play defensive end in a pinch, so that does make sense. Even though he's listed as a defensive tackle, I think he could kick out to defensive end if they ever had to do so. He has the physical abilities. So released was James Esther and Devontae O'Malley. I don't expect either of those two players to be viable for the practice squad. And in fact, the practice squad might not have any defensive tackles simply because they kept 6, which should be sufficient for the season barring injury. Let's go to linebackers here. Quay Walker, Edwin Cooper, Isaiah McDuffie, and Tyron Hopper. So we're only keeping 4. I predicted that there would be 5 linebackers, including Christian Welch as my 5th linebacker. So it's going to be interesting to see what this tells me. This tells me either the Packers are hoping Christian Welch will make it to the practice squad. If not, maybe they take Simmons on the practice squad. I don't know, because he has a pretty high salary, and they might not want to put that salary onto the practice squad. Or another option here, and it's likely that they're targeting Welch for the practice squad, but if Welch gets claimed by somebody else, they're probably going to look at the waiver wire to see if there's another linebacker they like better than Simmons, Johnson, or Bartlett. So I would expect either Welch makes it to the practice squad or the Packers add another linebacker to the practice squad, because 4 is really thin at linebacker. Basically, that means you can have 1 injury, right? Because you're going to start 3 in early downs, which is going to be Quay, Cooper, and McDuffie. Although I really would like to see Hopper be that 3rd linebacker, maybe after the bye week. So that gives you the injury risk of 1 player, which is really, really thin. Plus, that doesn't allow your linebackers to ever get off the field and rest if there's an injury. So let's say they go into week 1 with these 4 linebackers, and Isaiah McDuffie gets hurt. You slide in Tyron Hopper as that 3rd linebacker, but then you've got no depth in case there's another injury, and you have no opportunity to put someone in to spell the linebacker, so they're going to be playing every single down on 1st and 2nd down, and that's a lot to ask. So I do expect the Packers to add a viable player to their practice squad that can actually play linebacker, not just play special teams. There's the distinction. There's linebackers that can play special teams, but would be a significant liability if they're put on the field. And there's a player like Christian Welch, who I believe has enough to show that could be viable as depth if they're called up from the practice squad. Let's look at cornerbacks. A little short here. I think I projected that they would take 7, and they ended up only taking 6. We have Nate Hobbs, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine, Bo Melton, Kamal Haddon, and Mika Robinson. Let's put our injury analysis hat on right now, okay? Putting that on. This tells me Nate Hobbs is looking good for week 1, because I think if there was a chance Nate Hobbs wasn't ready for week 1, they probably would have kept 7 just to have enough depth for week 1 and week 2, which, remember, there's only 5 days between week 1 and week 2, so you really need to have enough depth for basically both those games in one roster, so to speak, because you're only going to have 5 days to elevate somebody and get them practice time. So they must feel really good about Nate Hobbs being eligible for week number 1. So that's another injury hint that I'm seeing from this roster. Released were Kellen King, Corey Ballantyne, and Tyron Herring. I'm really surprised. I actually had them keeping Corey Ballantyne on the active roster. He's been on the active roster before. He has a lot of experience with the offense. So Carrington Ballantyne is kind of a surprise to me. But I think what that means to me is Kellen King and Corey Ballantyne, if they make it through waivers, and I think Kellen King is probably most likely to make it through waivers of the two, I think both of those players will make it onto the practice squad. Up at safety, we have Xavier McKinney, Evan Williams, Javon Bullard, Zane Anderson. That tells me his knee is good. So Zane Anderson is going to be available for week 1. And Katan Oladapo. So that tells me Zane Anderson is going to be ready for week 1, because I think they probably would have kept another player if they were worried about week 1 for Zane Anderson. So Zane Anderson has played well in the regular season before in spurts, so it makes sense that he makes the roster if he is healthy. On injured reserve, and I'm really happy to see that the Packers did this, is Omar Brown. Not only does he have a lot of potential, but he's coming off of a severe lung injury. So I think it's a class act for the Packers to put him on injured reserve. So he's going to be paid his salary so he can rest and recover from his lung injury. He won't be able to play in 2025, but the Packers can see what they have from him in 2026. And I think that was a really smart move, because I liked what Omar Brown has done in the preseason and in practice, but also it's a class act move for me for the Green Bay Packers to do that. More likely they did it because it was smart. Otherwise, they could have released him with an injury settlement. But I think the fact that they kept him on injured reserve tells me that the Packers like his potential. Released was Jonathan Baldwin, who I thought was going to make the practice squad, so we'll see what happens there. So Baldwin might slip onto the practice squad for some depth there. Your special teams, of course, are Brandon McManus, Daniel Whelan, and Matt Orsick. So let's look at some noteworthy items here. I haven't looked at this before. Packers have retained all 8 of their draft picks from 2025, though 2, Colin Oliver and John Williams, are on the season physically unable to perform list. Packers' 53-man roster is comprised of 41 draft picks and 12 undrafted free agents. 32 players were drafted by Brian Gutekunst. Bo Melton makes the 53 after transitioning from receiver to cornerback. Okay, so there's some interesting news and notes on the roster. It'll be interesting to see now over the next 24 to 48 hours who gets put on the practice squad, because the Packers have to look at their players plus every player that was released. So if you're in the Packers GM staff, they are looking at tape like crazy of their players, and also every player that they might have a role for that was cut today. So they're going to be burning the midnight oil trying to figure out who they want to claim on waivers. So we're going to watch that very closely. So that's it for this edition of the Pack Attack Cast, your 53-man roster reaction video. I hope you found it interesting. I tried to give you some thoughts about how the roster reflects some injury news and how the practice squad might shape up after this. I'll be watching this very closely. I'll be back tomorrow with news and notes and start really looking at this updated roster and how it impacts week one. Because I've told you before, I think week one is a tone setter for the entire season. So we're going to look at the updated roster, who's available for week one. If there's any practice squad news, I'll have that for you tomorrow afternoon. And also look at week one, because now it is game time. We've got 12 days before the Packers are on the field against the Detroit Lions. I will be in the stands. I will be so excited to see that game because I do feel that it is a trendsetter. If the Packers win week one, it sends messages to the NFC North, to the NFC, to the Packers themselves about what their potential is for the season. It is an amazing tone setter game, and I'm really going to focus on that for the next 2 weeks and getting you ready for that game against the Detroit Lions. Because if they win that game, it is a huge statement game for the NFL and for the roster. They need to build momentum. It is important for many ways. Obviously, in my mind, it's a two-team race between the Packers and the Lions for the division this year. Getting an early lead on the Lions is going to be huge because the Lions have a very tough first 10 games. And if the Packers can get a couple game lead on the Lions, like let's say we're through week 8 and the Packers have a 2 to 3 game lead on the Lions, that is huge for the NFC race, NFC North race. In addition to that, the game against the Lions is the only division game until week 12 where the Packers play the Vikings. I'll also be at that game. And it is going to be huge for the Packers to switch their divisional record. What they did last year was not good enough to win the division. If they start out with a win against Detroit, that sends a message to the NFL and the NFC North that there could be a new king in town of the NFC North. So I'm very excited about that, as you can see, because I just went off on a huge tangent, but that's okay. We'll be back tomorrow with an update on the roster, any any practice squad news that we might have, any news and notes around the NFC North. I want to take a look at who the other teams in the NFC North pick up and how that might impact the race for the NFC North. And we're going to get you ready for that week 1 game against the Detroit Lions. So give us a subscribe. If it's your first time watching the Pack Attack Cast, give us a subscribe. We're right at 8,500 right now. We'd like to get to 9,000 by week 1. So that's 500 subscriptions in 13 days or 12 days. Can we get there? It's up to you. And we'll see you tomorrow. As always, go Pack Go.